Kia ora, annyeong haseyo, konnichiwa, ni hao, namaste. Hello and welcome very much. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third session of Becoming Better Together, panel discussions organized for a wide-ranging audience nationally in New Zealand and globally as well, for those who would like to tune in. Today's session is Faith and Business, Strategizing for an Unknown World. Thank you for joining us today again. It's a 1-hour session and we are also recording this on YouTube. So if you need to go off somewhere during this time, we hope you will come back and join us for the full session on YouTube. Kia ora, mai no tātou katoa, ko e tāku e no. He tangata teriti aho, no reira tēnā tātou katoa. So I was speaking in Te Reo, the indigenous language of the Tangata Whenua, or the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Professor Edwina Pio, and I'm the facilitator for today's session. I'm also a trustee on the National Religious Diversity Centre, and I chair the program committee. I'm New Zealand's first Professor of Diversity and also University Director of Diversity at the Auckland University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand. Again, delighted that you're here to join us. I'd like to remind us of the mission statement of the Religious Diversity Centre, which is to promote understanding, appreciation, and respect for religious diversity among the religious, spiritual, and secular communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This centre was launched in 2016. Our patron is the Honourable Helen Clark, a previous Prime Minister of New Zealand. It's also a go-to place for research, information, education, and training. Today's session, Faith and Business, Strategizing for an Unknown World, focuses on the role of faith in these pandemic-ravaged times. Historically, of course, there has been tension between what faith means and how organizations are managed. In fact, faith is often seen synonymously with spirituality and religion. And when we think of religion being the opium of the people and what's happened because of that, then we have seen a secular and sacred divide, which often continues into organizations today, making many people who are faith-based and who strongly believe in their faith in organizations thinking that, well, maybe these people are oppressed, maybe these people really need to leave their faith outside the organization before they come in. But we hope through this particular discussion, as well as your other readings, one would see the importance of faith, which means bringing one's whole self to work and to reduce and check unlimited and unsustainable growth, corporate greed, and a world that is on the brink of so many catastrophes, whereas faith, we hope, can make a difference. And that's what our wonderful panelists are going to share with us. We have 3 beautiful panelists and handsome panelists today. We have Dr. Betty O'Fay Grant, a New Zealand Pacifica academic from the Auckland University of Technology. She works in the area of resources, more specifically with Pacifica people. Her PhD research found that Samoans incorporate cultural values, including religious faith, as part of their professional development and to have successful business careers. Our second panelist is Rod Oram, who's a business journalist. He contributes weekly to Newsroom, 9 to Noon, and News Talk ZB. He is a public speaker on deep sustainability, business economics, and innovation, and is also a member of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. He was a founding trustee and the second chairman of the Akina Foundation, which helps social enterprises develop their business models in areas of sustainability. Our third panelist is the managing director of Image Text, Darius Mystery. Darius migrated to New Zealand in 1987 with his wife after doing postgraduate studies in business and accounting. He's got extensive experience in the IT industry, has been a top-selling sales executive for Apple, and after that wonderful experience, he is the chief executive of Image Text, New Zealand's premier Apple system integrator that employs 22 staff. So we have three panelists with wide-ranging experience. The first question that we are going to look at is, what does faith mean to you? And this question is going to Dr. Betty. So Betty, over to you.
Thank you, Edwina. This question about what faith means to me. So I thought about this for a while and tried to figure out what does this actually mean to me, because when you hear this word faith, it sounds like something so simple, but actually when I tried to think, well, what does it mean? It was quite difficult to come to some real explanation. And I think that's because faith, the overarching meaning of faith to me, is that you have some type of trust or some type of faith or belief in a higher power. And so this is where faith to me is part of a religious concept. So, for example, I was raised with my parents who raised me as a Christian. So we had faith in terms of Christianity. So we were raised with Bible principles. So a lot of how I see faith is based on religion. So it has traditional values. It also has limitations and restrictions that are in place. But then there's also faith from a philosophical view. So how I see faith in myself or in somebody else, the faith that I have in processes and systems, such as work, and the way that we do things at work. So there's two concepts around faith. So that's philosophical and religion, but also the overarching concept of faith in that we believe in something that gives us this motivation, this system of values that guides the way I behave and the way that I respond to things.
Thanks for that, Betty. So you mentioned that faith refers to philosophy, it refers to religion, it provides us with a system of values. And you've also mentioned that you were brought up in the Christian tradition, that it means trust, it's a religious concept, and there is belief in a higher power. We move now to Darius. And Darius, what does faith mean to you?
Well, I was brought up in a very religious environment when I was growing up as a child. Both my mom and dad were extremely religious. My dad used to pray on a regular basis. And from my perspective, religion has been imbibed into everything and anything you do. And I come from a very old, ancient Persian religion called Zoroastrianism, which is not extensively practiced these days at all. But my religious beliefs were imbibed into me from the childhood. And the religious beliefs were based on three very strong principles that my religion teaches. And the tenets are good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. And the philosophy of the religion is that human being is being he's another form of the Almighty. The Almighty created the human being with a mind to bring himself to the same levels that he himself has reached. So that's my belief of faith. But on the other hand, if you look at the core dictionary meaning, it means fidelity to one's promises and alliances to duty. And that's the other side of faith, which is the more practical side of faith. So, but from my perspective, my religious beliefs are more what I believe faith is. And that's what I bring to my business practices and also to my day-to-day living.
Thank you for that, Darius. So, like Betty, you too were brought up with religion right from the time you were young, based on your parents' practices, and your religious faith is Zoroastrianism.
That's
Uh,
right.
said Persian, and for our viewers, Freddie Mercury
That's
of
what.
Rhapsody, in fact, was a Zoroastrian. The Tata group of companies who own Tata Tea, who own Rover, and a number of British companies are also of Zoroastrian origin. And Darius, you mentioned that for you, faith means good thoughts, good words, good deeds. But with reference to your organization, it also means fidelity to your duties. And we'll talk more about faith in organizations shortly. But let's move to the other panelist, Rod. Rod, over to you.
Well, kia ora tato, and a great pleasure to be on the panel with you, and greetings to our people who have logged on to listen to us. For me, faith has been inevitably a journey. So when I was young, growing up in England and raised in the Anglican Church, it was indeed about a simple, fairly simple view of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And one sort of grew into that as one got older. But it was also very importantly a part of sort of cultural reference, both in language, in literature, in the Bible itself, in the arts and in music and other ways. And so it suffused life in that sense. But from quite a young age, I was aware of contradictions. So my father was rather cool, should we say, about Catholics and other religions, and things didn't quite gel for me, because on one hand, I was being taught that about the great love of God and Christ and the rest, but I wasn't seeing these things working out quite that simply in everyday life. So as time's gone on, my faith has continued to grow and develop, and it is very much a touchstone for me to give me a sense of the unknown infinite beyond, and of great connectivity in the world, that spiritual connection, and the power of God and all of those things. But on that journey, there have been times that I've been very involved in the church in institutional terms, and then times that it's got frustrating and I've backed away from that. And I'm now in a different kind of phase of my life. And I will, in terms of my central preoccupation as a human being, as a business journalist, as a father, a husband, is our relationship with the living planet, because we humans are doing very considerable damage to all the other life forms on the planet, and indeed to human beings themselves. And the earth is literally our life support system. So I've come to the conclusion that we won't care enough about that until we can do enough about all that to get to right relationships with other people, with the living planet, unless there is we have a spiritual relationship with them. And so that's the journey I've been on, but all the way through it, it's been a way, my faith has been a way to anchor me and to guide me in life, but also at the same time to open up my horizons to the wonder of creation, the wonder of God's gifts, and the community of the spirit in which I live and work.
Thanks for that, Rod. I mean, you've spoken about the fact that faith is a journey, and it's a relationship with the living, with the unknown, with the infinite, and it suffuses life. You've mentioned the Trinity as well, and of course, there's so much of heterogeneity in Christianity with the Anglicans, the Catholics, the Presbyterians, Latter-day Saints, etc., just like there are in other religions, and how your faith has informed arts, music, literature, as well as the contradictions in it. And I'd like to emphasize the deep sustainability that you mentioned and looking after the planet. And of course, with the indigenous people of New Zealand, particularly, there is the concept of kaitiakitanga. And how do we manifest that, perhaps through our faith, for example, in terms of looking after the planet, which is our lifeblood and which does sustain us. So if we pick that aspect up, how does faith impact your work? And Rod, if I might ask you to pick that up as a follow through from what you have just said, please.
I would have to confess, fairly happily in one sense, in retrospect, that for many decades in my career as a journalist, I didn't deny my faith, but neither did I actively talk about my faith. So my friends and fellow journalists knew I was a member of a parish church and was active in that, but I never really talked about that or never really spoke of what it meant to me. And one of the reasons for that, I think the core reason for that, was that we were already at a time, we're now talking about the 70s and 80s, where an expression of faith, such as I would have made in such discussions, could be seen as a way of being sort of semi-detached from the world, or that faith clouding my judgment in some way as a journalist. I never felt that. I felt that my faith was giving me very good guidance through complicated issues, trying to feel my way to what the heart of an issue was. And it's only in recent years that, and literally, I mean the last 6-8 years, that I've been rather more explicit about that. And the older I get, the easier I find that to be. And sorry, one other point about that. When I first arrived in New Zealand, so we're talking about the late 90s, I arrived in 97. The Business Roundtable was the dominant sort of intellectual force in business and in politics, and particularly on the economics and business side of politics. And Roger Kerr, who was the executive director of the Business Roundtable, was openly, I'm choosing my word carefully because I'm not quite sure what word to use, certainly skeptical. I felt really quite hostile about the sort of key concepts and key beliefs that my faith led me to, in terms of great equity, great sharing, support for other people. I always felt the sort of neoliberalism that he embraced was rather more ruthless and self-centered. And I happily engaged on those issues, but from a relatively dry and formal economic and business point of view, because there were very good alternative arguments to make, arguments that were widespread elsewhere in the world. So I didn't resort to faith in that. So to me, it's getting more and more interesting as I get older, that I am bringing faith into these issues. And but it was only a few years ago on 9 to Noon when discussing the climate crisis with Catherine Ryan, that was the first time I brought that question of spiritual relationship into that discussion. And I was very glad I did. I sort of steeled myself for doing that, this was the program on, this was the subject I was going to do it. And it actually felt good. And I'm now thinking, gosh, I should have been doing that decades ago. But anyway, never too late. Good to do it now.
Thank you for that, Rod. And I'm going to ask Darius to respond to some of the things which Rod referred to, like a ruthless view. That would be the antithesis of the faith-based view, perhaps, but also a developmental view that as one moves through the different phases of one's life, um, how does one bring in the faith aspect to it and the expression of faith, making sure that it doesn't really cloud one's judgment? So, Darius, what would you like to say with reference to that?
Well, I tend to treat the religion and faith in a more simplistic manner rather than a more philosophical manner. And if you correlate it, as you said, to bring it to your own business, you have multiple stakeholders in your business. You have your employees, your customers, your suppliers, your shareholders, all the rest of them. And if you try to bring faith as a sort of a moral compass for you to follow when you come to crossroads in business decision making for all of your stakeholders, it helps you, gives you some guidance as to what you should and you shouldn't be doing. And especially at crossroads, when when you are in a situation where, for example, if you said the right things, you might lose the client. But if you turn the facts around a bit, you might be able to retain the client, which is what every business tries for. That's when your faith comes into play, and you say, what is the right way to do it? And if you are truly of the opinion that faith and religion and what the teachings are supposed to be used on a day-to-day basis, you would do the right thing, and eventually, and I've seen it in my own business several times, you might lose that particular client because you took the right decision based on your faith and your education and your religious beliefs. But sooner or later, you will realize that that was the right thing to do, because maybe that client was not the right client for you. And I use well, as I said, I've been brought up in a sort of a very religious uh, sort of family background, and prayers were very important for us all our lives growing up. And I still continue to do my prayers a bit in the morning and a bit in the evening, and just use it in a more practical form, saying, I ask for guidance from that supernatural human being, whomever it is. I don't personify him as a god. There's something beyond what we human beings don't comprehend completely. And maybe that prayers are the medium of asking for that guidance in your day-to-day decision making in business, and in your day-to-day decision making in life as well, but primarily in business, where you do have decisions where you have to outweigh your bottom line profits versus what would be the right thing for, say, for instance, your employee or for your supplier. And I think that's how faith has helped me to not only be good in my day-to-day living, but also help me in my own business dealings. And so far, because we have been in business for the last 30 odd plus years, and been surviving, and every time I talk to my clients, even the clients who have left me have come back and said, you were the best clients, you were the best, you know, business partner that we dealt with. So I think that brings me more joy than just the pure dollars that it brings you by taking the shortcuts in life, which faith prohibits you from taking.
Thank you for that, Darius. I think I'd like to dovetail what you've said with one of the things that Rod mentioned, which is the importance of faith and, in some ways, having the courage to talk more about it, particularly, for example, as a journalist. in the case of Rod, in the case of you, Darius, for example, as Chief Executive for Image Text, and you mentioned good thoughts, words, deeds. So that's serving as a moral compass, but also being aware, like Rod mentioned, about the infinite wonder of this higher power and how that a wondrous being can inform what we do so that we do the right thing. And particularly when we are at a crossroads, that gives us a form of guidance, which perhaps if we didn't pray, for example, Darius, you mentioned prayer, maybe that impetus to do the right thing might not be that strong. So, Betty, over to you. What would you like to add on to what these brilliant gentlemen have shared with us?
Well, I have to agree with everything that they said. Faith, to me, it's like a grounding mechanism, particularly at work and when times are quite tough, especially this year with COVID. We had to do things differently, just like most businesses. We had to change the processes that we use, the teaching styles. And so faith was one of the things that, we really had to rely on ourselves, on a higher power, and also other colleagues to help us get through these times. So in some ways, faith is like what everyone else here has said. It's something that we actually cannot see, but we know it's there. And it's hard to give it a definite explanation, but that whole concept of faith is something that we all believe in and helps us to get through our day to day. And with me, it also motivates you to behave a certain way according to some of the extenuating circumstances that COVID has presented to us, so that faith actually guides the way that we behave or our responses, maybe our attitudes, so that we're all doing something to get the job done, whether it's our mahi at work or at home. And we saw this with COVID. I think it's fair to say that New Zealand as a nation, we all stood in solidarity, believing in having faith that we would get through this this time of COVID, and something that we're still working on.
Thanks for that. Would Darius or Rod like to respond to the specific COVID aspect that Betty has just brought into focus? Darius, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, if you look at what COVID has done, basically it has impacted businesses, whether you like it or not, severely, because especially the small to medium sized businesses, and I consider myself as a sort of SME. A two sort of solid months of lockdown impacts your bottom line significantly. And if you didn't have your faith to guide you during those tough times, it becomes very difficult to basically take the right decisions to make sure that the business goes forward. And a classic example is we were on crossroads when, after the first lockdown, we lost about 30% of our business because we have quite a lot of small to medium sized clients who just closed the business and walked away. They canceled our contracts. They decided to postpone some of the projects that were in the pipeline, and we had to make a decision. What do we do? Do we make people redundant? How do we move forward? And my faith basically said, well, if you have faith, and if you have faith in the Almighty, things will eventually turn out right. So we decided, we'll start from the top. The leadership team decided to take a drop in their salary. We first took all the three executives decided to take a 20%, 25% drop in our salary. Then we went to the staff and said, which of you are willing to do it? And some of them said, we can afford to. Some of them said, we can't afford to. We said, okay, that's fine. We'll let you decide. Whoever wants to take cuts, take cuts. The rest can consume their holidays during these tough times. And through the whole lot, we came out reasonably strong as human beings as well. And I think if the leadership didn't have the courage to take those right decisions, businesses could have been in a severe state. And that's where I think a strong faith in a moral compass helps you when you come across these sorts of crossroads.
So, Darius, thanks for that. You were talking about I mean, the real problem, should we make people redundant or not? If, as leaders, we decide to take a cut in our salary, should others follow? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. And of course, how do leaders set the example in these difficult times? And Rod, would you like to continue on with this, with some of your thoughts?
Yes, I certainly relate very strongly to what Darius is saying there. But let me add another perspective that I think is quite complementary to it, which is that first of all, as a society, as a country, we saw terrific, a high level of cohesion, of solidarity in this. And so I think COVID's been, for all the trauma and difficulty and everything of it, I think it's been a wonderful chance for people to experience that. We know from international data that we have a strong sense of community in New Zealand. So if you're looking at the OECD's Better Life Index and you look at the community part of that, and the data in there shows us that almost 96% of New Zealanders say they know who they would turn to when they needed help. Now, clearly that's not perfect because all sorts of people don't get the support they need or don't have enough friends. But I think that's a strong indication of that sense of community. So what I saw from a business point of view, which was quite fascinating, was that because a lot of companies were doing remote working, and that put huge strain on people being at home, juggling children, partners, life, and still trying to do work. And what I found in companies that I was talking to about this was a very strong sense of needing to adapt their company culture to be far more supportive of those people. And so when people were online on a call or in discussion, tuning in very carefully to how they seem to be responding or asking them directly, well, how are you? Tell me what's going on. And I thought that was very powerful. I'm hoping, and I haven't had a chance to go back and check this with many companies yet, I'm hoping that is actually quite a significant change that they see the benefits of, and therefore they will try to keep that up even as things get back to a bit more normal, and they're still coping with even other big issues that still need to unfold, will still unfold through COVID. So I'm hoping that experience will help reinforce the cultures of those organizations. And in my terms, and obviously you don't have in any way have to have some sort of faith or spiritual life in particular to relate to this. And that just felt really good to me as a Christian in terms of seeing more of that love out there and that concern for people.
Okay. So, I mean, Rod, you were emphasizing, like Betty as well as Darius did, that during COVID times, the importance of solidarity, of cohesion, and which New Zealand, as a team of 5 million, 5.2, if I looked at New Zealand stats, the census today, and the sense of community that has come in because of it. You also referred to the OECD Better Life Index, which I think gives us a good indicator of where we stand. Of course, there's no room for complacency. We have to move forward in terms of what we think. But the emphasis that I think all three panelists have made is the hope that the changes that we were in some ways forced into because of COVID, that some of them continue. For example, the braiding of what we feel emotionally, the deeper aspects of ourselves, and bringing that into the organizational culture. And that's going to help us adapt to bringing our whole selves, including our faith, into what we do. Any specific examples that you would like to share in this regard? Betty, anything that jumps up in your mind?
Yes. So I do have some examples of where our faith during the COVID times really pushed us to do some wonderful things. And I saw that with the way that we worked in my department. I saw that the pastoral care that the lecturers, and this I think it's fair to say this is across all universities globally, that our pastoral care with our students and among our own colleagues increased. And that was because we were all experiencing more or less the same issues that impacted not only on our work, but at our home lives. And so when we look at inclusivity and how this has been permeated into the business, COVID did in some ways increase that, increased our inclusivity and our solidarity as a people, one nation. And so I think that with faith, we did see that happening at our workplace, definitely at my workplace, and the conversations that I've had with other colleagues. I also feel that students also felt that solidarity too, because when you reach out to students to see if they are coping, how are they doing well? And I think Rod also touched on this, is that our care increased because we wanted to know that our students were okay with what was happening and making sure that they still had, or they were not falling behind because of what was happening with COVID. And so their belief systems in themselves and their confidence may have dropped. So there were some benefits that came out of this COVID and some things and work that was connected to faith and how we view faith and how we receive it and respond in different behaviors.
Thanks for that, Betty. You've mentioned pastoral care and inclusivity permeating what we do and permeating all aspects of our life, and driven in many ways by our faith. Rod, any examples that you might like to bring up with reference to this permeation of specific aspects of culture, if you will, because of the faith that we have?
Um, Gosh, it's not that they're not there. It's just a question of trying to identify them. There is an aspect, though, that I wish I had much greater experience of. So I see what's gone on, for example, in my parish church and more widely about some other parishes. So I have a sort of my Anglican response. But I would be fascinated to know how the response has been for people of different faiths through this. And again, how that might have worked out through various forms of work. And I'm afraid I just don't have a sense of that. Other than a real quite a strong sense that even if people were not necessarily, some of the people I've been in touch with have not had a formal or even a self-confessed or an explicit faith, there was still a sense of coping with life and all of its current challenges by having that sort of a greater sense of purpose, or a sort of a picture sort of beyond their normal view. Yes, so those are some of the things that have been on my mind.
Yes, and thanks for that, Rod, because different religions, I'm sure, have responded slightly differently based on what their religious scriptures say and how they feel they needed to respond at that point in time. But I think a theme that all three of you have mentioned is prayer. So, what happens? How do we go back to ourselves and find fulfillment through our faith in the religious tradition that we were brought up with? And there's a little story about a seeker who asked the Sufi Jalaluddin Rumi if the Quran was a good book to read. And this Sufi mystic replied, "You should rather ask yourself if you are in a state to profit from it." And in a similar way, a Christian mystic used to say of the Bible, "However useful a menu, it is not good for eating." So we have our wonderful religious scriptures, but of course, it's the enactment of those through the faith that we believe, that we profess, and how that impacts what happens at work. Darius, over to you. Any examples that you would like to give from your extensive experience in IT?
Uh, well, again, as I said, I've always treated prayers as just a source of thankfulness and a source of inspiration from the divinity, whoever it is. And I don't treat it as anything other than that. So in the morning, I pray to the divinity to give me the right guidance, and in the evening, I pray to say thank you for making me last this day and turn into a good human being and a better than what I was yesterday. And if I look at how it affects me from a business perspective, being a small, medium-sized business, we don't have huge amounts of middle management structures. So most of the difficult decisions have to be taken by people like me and my business partner, who we are the directors of the business, so we had to make the decisions. So when we have tough decisions that come across, like when I had a client who just refused to pay me the money because of whatever reason, I don't want to get into it, and we knew it was not our fault. We knew it was something to do with the product which we have not manufactured. We are just a middleman. But he just said, "No, that's it. I don't want to listen to any other story. I just use my usual methods, which is I think about the issue before I go to bed and leave it to the divinity to solve it. And the next day in the morning, somehow or the other, the problem gets solved." So I have basically used my prayers as a sort of asking for divine guidance, and it has helped me in several times in all my decision making. So that's how I built the faith in my prayers.
Yes. Thanks for that, Darius. I think if we go to the Jesuit tradition or the Catholic tradition, they often speak of discernment. So, prayer perhaps gives us clarity. Or if we look at the Buddhist tradition in terms of meditation, where because we meditate, because we are quiet, it settles the different things in our mind so that we are able to really grasp what the core issues are and then deal with that. There are two more aspects that I'd like to run through before our time is up. One is the dark side of faith. And if any of you would like to comment on that, Betty, would you like to pick that up?
Like all things, there is a dark side to concepts and the way that we see the world. And when you think about the dark side of faith and business, I guess that because we are diverse and we all bring ourselves to work, there will be a clash of sometimes the way that we see the world and the way that we make our decisions. And so sometimes, for example, the way that we demonstrate or we express our faith might be more silent, might be more individualized, and perhaps we hold it close to our heart. Whereas we might have business with someone whose faith is more expressed, publicly expressed. So they might be more vocal in the way that they express their faith. And so sometimes these two ideals will clash simply because of the way that we express our faith. And that kind of leads on to how we tolerate. If we took the view of faith from a religious concept, we now know that the way that we express our faith at work is much more greater than it used to be 10, 20 years ago, when it was perhaps just isolated to ourselves. And we see that at work, we now see evidence that religion or our belief systems of a higher power has permeated into the business. And we see that because of sometimes we hear the terms faith-based businesses or faith-based practices. Hiring someone who has that type of personality that's virtuous, honest, trustworthy. Those are all attributes and qualities that are ascribed to faith. And we see that now in business. So there is evidence that faith and business have the symbiotic relationship that works. But in saying that, there is also that other side where perhaps it's not as strong, and perhaps there are issues and challenges between having the two primary dimensions of faith and business working side by side. They might be diametrically opposed.
Thanks for that, Betty. And I think that's really an issue that organizations struggle with, because one might have faith, but how one expresses it is something that organizations are not sure what should they do about it. If they say something, is it going to be misconstrued? If they don't say something, is it also going to be misconstrued? So, Darius, would you like to pick up that aspect of the symbiotic relationship between faith and business, yet it does have a dark side?
Yes, I do agree, and that's where I would say the religious extremism comes into play. And if you try to follow it from a non-practical extremist sort of pure traditional form and bring that kind of your faith into a business environment, I think it has detrimental effects not only on the business but all the people working in it as well. Because that's when you have the discriminatory aspect of it. You would choose your employees based on what they profess, what they believe, what they faith, rather than on their capabilities. You treat issues that come up based on the more traditional side of thing, yes or no, and you don't have any sensible human judgment in it. So that's where I think the dark side of faith can be detrimental to business if it is not balanced correctly with your own humanistic judgment as well, rather than just use it as just yes or no and use faith as making that decision. That's where I think faith falls apart or religion falls apart.
Thanks, Darius. So, you brought in the aspect of religious extremism, or another term that's often used is fundamentalism.
Yep.
I think perhaps the belief that some individuals have that I'm right, and if you don't follow what I believe or articulate it in the way that I think it should be articulated, then you're wrong. So, if we look at it in that way, Rod, would you like to comment on that aspect in terms of how we can mitigate this dark side of faith?
I struggle with this constantly, not just in business, but across all of life, because when what I believe from the Gospels, the gospel imperatives as a Christian, and how radical Jesus was, radical in and God, Jesus, God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, radical love, and a sense of oneness there. That I really struggle with fellow Christians, fellow Anglicans, people of other faith, that are very narrowly focused on people just like them, and therefore don't have very different views from me, for example, on gay, lesbian people and couples and the rest. So and then another form of that is I see what can go on in business and particularly in politics. Less so, I think, in New Zealand than some other countries. I'm thinking, obviously, particularly of the United States, where those very hard line, very conservative, very narrow understanding of faith, I think it seems to me is very damaging. So I really struggle with that all the time. because you do then see, whether it's in politics or in business, that I think a very dark side. And yet, having said that, I just feel as though I'm saying, well, my interpretation of the Bible and my interpretation of what Jesus is saying, I'm saying I'm right and you're wrong. So I really, really struggle with that. And yet, I look at the US Supreme Court now. There is a significant number of those justices who are very conservative Catholics, both in their approach to the Constitution, but life in general, and all the rest. And I just really, really struggle with that. And I don't know what the answer is. And that's the dark side. And then, of course, it gets one stage a lot worse than that when we get into religious extremism that ends up in violence and death, destruction in various forms.
Thanks for that, Rod. I think extremism, fundamentalism, they are difficult issues to deal with. But of course, if we think of religion as a tapestry and life as a tapestry with so many beautiful motifs based on different religions, knowing that none of them are in themselves the best way for everyone. Each one has their own way and their own styles. I think that brings a lot of richness when we are looking at faith and business. The final aspect, and of course, those who are watching are welcome to raise questions if you wish to. You can type that into the Zoom chat session. Two recommendations that each of you would like to have and suggest to our viewers to entwine faith and business for human flourishing. So, Darius, let's start with you.
Well, I think if you take whatever your faith, whatever your beliefs are, and treat it from a sort of a practical perspective rather than a fundamentalistic perspective, and bring it into your business environment, it's definitely going to help you. But again, as Rod said, if you use it more on a sort of a extremist perspective and say there is either right or wrong, and what my faith says is right and everybody else is wrong, that's where the whole issue of religion falls apart. And we live in a society where we live in a multicultural society. And I remember reading an article in the Times magazine years ago, about 16 years ago, when they were describing the Californian economy in the United States. And they said California was the 5th largest economy in the world, not only in the US, but in the world. And one of the reasons the investigative journalist came up with was where employers did not believe in hiring for anything other than skills that they required. So they didn't believe in color, caste, creed, whoever. And that we saw that happening in that was mostly driven from the tech companies because they were all based in California. And we saw the good side of that approach of philosophy of faith, where you hire somebody not for the color of his skin or the tone of his voice or the accent that he talks to you, but for the skills he brings to the party. And that's where I think if you follow that, that's what faith is all about. That's what religion is all about. Treat every human being as you treat yourself.
Yes. Thanks for that, Darius. And that links to what you said in terms of how you were brought up in the Zoroastrian faith with your parents, seeing the divine spark in every individual. Betty, you mentioned earlier about recruitment and the importance of looking at value systems and virtuous aspects for recruitment. So, what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, so my recommendations is that HR and actually management should acquire some form of solid understanding of the different types of diverse faiths of their employees. And this is so that you can have an understanding of how they see things, which might, and the way that you process things, which might have an unintentional bias or a barrier to their progress at work. The other thing that HR should look at is crafting some type of support mechanisms to support workers of diverse faith. And that's because our workers are from from different types of countries around the world. So they bring themselves and their religion and their different faiths to work. So HR and management should have some understanding of accommodating these different types of faith. And actually, that's easy to say, very hard to do, because that's a huge scope to look at. But having these small incremental steps is how you start this. And I do recognize that, it's easy to say, but it's very difficult to do. But when you put something in place, like a support mechanism that looks at different types of faith at the workplace that your employees bring, then that starts the ball rolling.
Absolutely. And if I could use a word which Rod has used before with reference to sustainability, deep sustainability, I think the issue here is also of deep faith. So it's the interpretation of the religious text, but at a deep level. And that's why I mentioned before about some religious texts. How do we look beyond the words so that we are able to move into interpretations which bring about mystery, energy, spirit for flourishing, faithful futures? Rod, what would you like to add on?
To me, a wonderful starting point, and I've never actually had direct experience of this, and I don't know whether there are others might have in an organization, is that whatever our faith is, we learn from our faith some very particular, some very clear things about how we relate to other people. So therefore, when an organization is trying to develop its culture and the way people interact with each other, it would be wonderful if all the faiths represented in that group of employees had a chance to bring that faith perspective to creating that culture, because we get increasingly happy about discussing culture itself in those connections, but I think we've yet to bring sort of a spiritual dimension, and I think that could be quite wonderful. From that, the next thing would be possibly to start sharing things like feast days and high holidays, moments of great joy in our faiths, and be able to experience with people of other faith, perhaps slightly vicariously, but in some ways or otherwise engaged with them on those moments. And I think once we've developed those sorts of relationships, we might then be able to find ourselves trying to share some of our experiences about our spiritual lives, which I think could be quite fascinating, because in due course, that obviously builds a lot of connection and a lot of understanding. But it means that we're getting to know people, and rather than just sort of immediately putting up the roadblocks about a particular aspect of faith, or a particular religious practice which seems quite different to us or quite odd. And therefore, once we've been developing those relationships, we're then much more relaxed about those differences. One other thing is that, and if I go back to our relationship with creation, that's so powerful in all faiths. And therefore, as we're trying to work on these issues of deep sustainability, I think there's a huge amount we can do on an interfaith basis, to really draw strength and connection from that, as we're all trying to develop our spiritual relationship with the rest of the living earth. And quite honestly, I'm very disappointed about my Anglican church in that we're only started to edge towards that in a care of creation season now, running up to St. Francis Day in October. And the whole areas of eco-theology and eco-liturgy are very, still very experienced by very few people. And yet, for me personally, I'm finding that a very rich area for me, and by far the most profound area of spiritual growth that I think I've ever experienced. And I know that I'm still new and fresh in that journey, and believe there's some wonderful things still to, many wonderful things to discover.
Yes. So on that note, I would like to mention and takeaways for people who are going to be watching this, who are watching it currently. We've had 3 wonderful panelists, some words which perhaps might resonate with you as takeaways into the future: radical love, gratitude, the depth with which faith can guide us, a prayerfulness for a flourishing, faithful future that's linked to the planet, that's linked to what sustains us in terms of a higher power. Betty, Darius, and Rod, thank you so much for being here with us today. And our audience, thank you very much. We appreciate your presence. We appreciate your support. Thank you, Kiora. Go well. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
You're very welcome. Okay, so we've been looking at faith and business, strategizing for an unknown world. And thank you again. I hope you have taken away some wonderful thoughts and insights from today's program. Kia ora.